Over the past 2 weeks, Australia's Parliament has been investigating the role of social media in the country. The committee is covering a wide range of issues, from the influence social media has on people under 18 to the importance, or lack thereof, of news on social media. It's a unique opportunity for Australians to hear from some of the most covertly powerful people in our country, and it has raised more questions than it has answered. In today's podcast, we will explain what we have learned so far and what happens next. Sam, before we get started, I think we need to acknowledge that this story actually involves the Daily Oz in a weird way, and it's kind of one of those weird times that the media companies that are usually reporting on the news somehow kind of become the news.
Yeah, I have to make this pun to start. I mean, it's all feeling a bit meta, isn't it? Like, we're reporting on ourselves a little bit. It is going to involve meta, but I do think we need to start with a transparency statement. I know the audience really appreciates when we kind of lay our cards out on the table. So we're going to talk about the social media inquiry, and one part of the inquiry is about news on social media, which the Daily Oz is obviously involved in. And we always try and report on things without inserting our opinion. But I just wanted to acknowledge from the top that we're involved in this. We've made a written submission, and we can actually explain kind of what TDA wants from all of this at the end of the episode if we've got a bit of time.
So we're going to explain exactly what this social media inquiry is. But first, Sam, I just want to talk about a couple of months ago in March, you and Zara did an episode on this podcast on why news could disappear from Instagram, which would mean that the Daily Oz's Instagram account is wiped. Can you first just quickly give us a 30-second explainer on what that was and how we got to here where there is a social media inquiry?
Sure, and I'll put a link to that episode in the show notes if you want not a 30-second explainer, but more of a 15-minute explainer. But basically, there were deals signed between big commercial networks and Meta and Google, big two tech companies. And in exchange for content that news companies would put on these social media platforms, they believed they were entitled to money because of the ad revenue they were missing out of not having visitors to their own websites, but rather to social media networks. Meta and Google basically paid a fee for the companies to keep putting stuff on their channels. Now in February, Meta said we're not paying that fee again. And so the ball is now in the government's court, and the government has the choice now to be able to say, hey Meta, you need to pay a fee or you're going to get a penalty, and that's called designation. And so we're at the stage now where the government's considering whether to kind of enforce what's called the News Media Bargaining Code, enforce one part of that of designating Meta, which would mean that Meta has to pay a lot of money. Now, the only other country where that's happened is Canada. And in Canada, Meta responded to a similar decision by just withdrawing from news altogether.
Just to be clear though, the Daily Oz wasn't involved in those commercial deals with Meta. But if the government does designate Meta and then Meta takes news off Instagram, that's how this could impact us.
Yeah, and it's a super weird situation where we then would kind of be swept up in a segment-wide ban. It's quite an interesting one. Can't think of many other sectors where that would happen. But basically, that all got kind of tossed up in the air. Lots of people have been thinking about how to solve it. Since then, the Australian Parliament has had a lot of other discussions about social media. I mean, on this podcast, we've talked about raising the age of how old you should be to be allowed on social media. We've talked about eating disorders and how prevalent they are on social media. And it kind of got to a point where the government decided that there was enough here to launch what's called a joint select committee into social media. They're going to look at news as part of that, but there's pretty much every topic under the sun.
And so before we get into all of the other areas that they're also looking at in this committee, first, can you just explain what exactly is a joint select committee?
So a joint select committee is a temporary body. So after they're done with their investigation, they're disbanded and it never exists again. And it's set up for a very specific reason. So it's different to like a national security committee, which is always there. It might have rotating members that come and do a 2 or 3 year term, but the actual committee itself is a standing fixture in Australia. Now, the reason we say joint, that refers to the fact that it has members of both the House of Representatives, so MPs, and the Senate, so senators. And one other example to kind of paint a picture for you of the types of things these joint select committees look into is another one that's happening at the moment, literally, I think, next door to the social media inquiry. And that's a committee looking at the experiences of participants in the NDIS. So they can really be about anything. And these committees are not there to enforce anything. It's rather about having a conversation in public. It's all broadcast. It's all produced as transcripts, they gather information, and then they make recommendations to Parliament. And then it's Parliament's job to actually figure out whether they need to enforce those recommendations or not, and that's where legislation comes from. So whilst the committee can't actually make laws itself, they can question witnesses and they can really go pretty hard on witnesses. They can request documents, they can ask people to submit written submissions, pretty much anything that they think they need to do to get to what they see as the kind of truth of the matter.
So then give us an overview of what this committee is looking into.
So this committee has been set up, as it describes, quote, to inquire into and report on the influence and impacts of social media on Australian society.
Very broad.
Very broad. But they actually give 5 key areas in what's called the terms of reference, which is kind of a map of how this inquiry is going to roll out. So number 1, the use of age verification to protect Australian children. Number 2, Meta's decision to withdraw from those commercial deals we talked about before. Number 3, how social media contributes to mis and disinformation, which has been a really big focus of the government.
Especially in a big election year for the whole world.
It's huge. Definitely a very important year to have that chat. Number 4 is how algorithms and recommendations work and how that impacts the mental health of Australians. Fascinating language there. And the last one, to throw in a couple of big topics, scams, child sexual abuse and violent extremist material.
Wow.
So in short, everything from eating disorders all the way through to how to negotiate a new deal or a new media landscape between big news companies and social networks.
That's a lot of ground,
Yeah.
and we are now 2 weeks into these hearings. You've basically been listening to the entire thing.
Better than Netflix.
What have we learned so far?
It's been interesting seeing the order in which these discussions are panning out. So first we had the big media session, and that was this panel of 3 CEOs from Nine, News Corp and Seven. After that, we heard from some regulators. So think about like the ACCC looking at the competition environment of social media, the Safety Commissioner making comments on child sexual abuse and sextortion and eating disorder content being spread on social media. Then we heard from the independent digital publishers, so not the majors, but the minors, and that's represented by a man called Tim Duggan, who was the founder of Junkie, and he represents a body called the Digital Publisher Alliance. And then on Friday, we heard from representatives from Meta, who owns Instagram and Facebook, Google, Snapchat, and TikTok. And this Meta session, it was the first session on Friday, that was the interesting one. And I think it was one of the most important parts of the inquiry because Meta is at the center of a lot of these topics. It went for 2 hours and it was jam-packed.
So with the session on Meta, I know you were keen to hear about what they were going to say regarding news, particularly on Instagram. But they actually spent most of the session talking about safety, right? Yeah,
definitely. And the questions were really interesting because they were mostly centered on, in the question of safety, how Meta perceives itself in Australia. So does it perceive itself as an Australian company? Does it have ways to handle complaints or reports of scams in Australia? When you report something to be a piece of abusive content, who looks at that? And how quickly do they get to a decision? What age should people be allowed on social media? And there was a really interesting discussion about the age verification topic. I mean, this has been part of a larger discussion the government and the opposition are both aligned on, actually, and having whether we should increase the age from 13 to 16. I did an interview with Michael Whipfley from Nova. He's leading a campaign called 36 Months. I'll put a link to that episode as well in today's show notes. But I think the key moment, the highlight moment for me, was they dialed in the vice president and global head of safety from America. And she said about the experiences of children on the platform that Meta, according to its own research, quote, has not harmed children.
Interesting. That's a really big call to make. How did the committee respond to that?
Well, the committee had the same sort of reaction that you just had. They were a bit puzzled. They acknowledged that it was a different narrative to the one presented in a lot of research. Just last week, we had the US Surgeon General come out and say that social media causes immense harm. But it is in line with Meta's statements in other similar inquiries. Mark Zuckerberg said the same thing in front of the US Senate committee in his hearing earlier in this year. And one member of the committee in Australia on Friday said that Meta is performing a similar role to big tobacco of the 60s, which I thought was a fascinating comparison. And I'm not sure this is the last we're going to hear from Meta actually in this inquiry.
some major topics being discussed. Were there any other big learnings from Meta?
Well, there was one point they raised about the age verification discussion that I hadn't heard before. And that was that Meta are proposing that there's age verification not when you sign in to make a Facebook or an Instagram account, but when you download the app.
Oh, interesting.
So they're saying that the burden of enforcing age verification should be on Google and Apple from an app store perspective rather than from a sign-in perspective. That's a really interesting discussion. I kind of need to do a bit more research and think about what that could mean. And the other big theme was accountability. So who is Meta in Australia? How much tax do they pay in Australia? Who do they employ in their offices here? But there were also some really tough questions about how someone could sue Meta in Australia, because you need to sometimes physically deliver a document to somebody you want to sue. Who do you give the document to? Who's the executive with ultimate responsibility for the company's actions? I mean, this was some really big questions, and it was one of the more revealing discussions about the way that Meta works I've heard on the record in Australia in many years.
To bring this discussion back to the start, can you just explain how TDA has been involved in the process and what has this looked like for you?
I think it's kind of been the best way to learn about how a Joint Select Committee works is to kind of be part of the Joint Select Committee proceedings. So we submitted our written submission on Friday.
And what is TDA's position?
Well, because of that weird dynamic where TDA hasn't benefited from a commercial deal with Meta, we obviously don't want to be booted off Instagram. So we're actually asking the government not to pull that designation trigger on Meta. We kind of argue that there's other ways that news companies should be making money. They don't deserve money from technology companies. So in many ways, it's weird, but we almost agree half with social media companies and half with news companies. Very interesting position for us to be in. I'm trying to work out if I can provide one of those verbal submissions, so appear in front of the committee and give young people a voice, because the thing that's come up a lot in my meetings with government, opposition, independents, Greens, is that this is less about TDA and more about the voice of young people in this discussion, because traditional media have their print newspapers and they have their websites and their big subscriber bases. For young people, all the research now from reports last week, but also surveying we've done with our audience, shows that young people rely wholly on social media sometimes for their news consumption. And we think that's really valid and should be protected.
Yeah, I would say this discussion is so much bigger than the Daily Oz. This is about what would Australia look like if we didn't have news on social media? What kind of misinformation would then emerge? Because if you just have influencers who are able to put their opinion out there, but you're not able to have any fact-based information coming from a credible news source, what does that look like?
Yeah, it's a super interesting topic. I'm really enjoying kind of flying the flag of young people in this discussion. Let's see how we go.
Last question, do we have any idea on a timeline of when this committee will wrap up and then when we have an answer on whether the government will designate Meta?
So the committee has these hearing days. It's not every single day in a row. It's kind of sporadic through a calendar. So the next one is actually tomorrow in Canberra. And then they're due to write a report that's filed by November. So they're meant to gather all of their evidence over the next couple of months, get together their thoughts, write a document together, the 12 committee members, which would be an interesting Google Doc to be a part of, and then submit the report to the government by November. But the hearings could take any direction. I mean, we could get Meta back for a couple of days. We could hear from people we haven't even thought of yet. So it's a bit of uncertainty, bit of see how we go. But we're looking at, by the end of the year, a clear result.
Sam, thank you so much for explaining.
Thanks, Billy.
And before we go, one thing to mention is that today is the 1st of July.
Oh my
Happy new
gosh.
financial year.
Finally, those take an extra 20% off sales were going to stop coming through my inbox.
It is finally tax time. And if you are someone who is a bit confused about all of the different things that you need to know about tax, I know it can sometimes feel like you missed an entire class on all the different tax questions you have. We have an episode dedicated to just that, explaining
The FAQs.
Yes, explaining all of the different things that you need to know about tax time. It's actually become one of our most downloaded episodes ever.
Wow.
It has been very popular. We've had so much positive feedback. If you would like to listen to that, we will put a link to that in the show notes.
The show notes are packed today.
Thank you so much for listening to The Daily Oz. If you would like to help us grow, if you could press follow on Spotify or Apple, it will really help us. Or if you're watching us on YouTube, we do put all of our podcasts up there now, where you can also watch us do the recording. If you can press subscribe, it also helps us grow. Thank you so much, and we'll be back again tomorrow.